name's Jeff Robinson, and this is the second video of a multi-part video series that I'm conducting based on my book, Saved by Grace Through Faith, which is a critique of Calvinism, the system of theology that is espoused by Reformed Christians, Calvinists, and concerning the doctrine of salvation. The subtitle here says, A Biblical and Theological Critique of Calvinist Soteriology, Doctrine of Salvation. I want to talk today about original sin. Original sin forms a key part of the first element in TULIP, Total Depravity. It's an essential component of it, especially for Calvinists. It's foundational, in fact, for the doctrine of total depravity. 3 points I want to make briefly about original sin. Original sin is widely held in the Western Church, but interestingly enough, is generally rejected by the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox series of churches. This doctrine was first explicitly stated by Augustine in the 5th century, especially with his disputes with Pelagius, British monk. It's generally here in the Western churches to be, especially amongst evangelical churches, to be uncontroversial. It's just assumed to be true. It's not questioned, it's just accepted. But in my book, I challenge this assumption and actually seek to demonstrate that this doctrine of original sin is actually unbiblical. What is original sin? Here's a definition I made up. Original sin is the belief that subsequent to Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden, everyone without exception is born with a morally and spiritually corrupted human nature, somehow inherited from Adam himself. Many, for example Calvin, also include the idea that everyone is born bearing the guilt of Adam for Adam's sin. That's what original sin is. And in this video I want to show you what Calvinists actually say concerning this doctrine. Wayne Grudem, Professor of Theology and Biblical Studies at Phoenix Seminary, and who has authored a very influential systematic theology, says this concerning inherited guilt, the guilt that supposedly we all inherit because of Adam's sin. We are counted guilty because of Adam's sin. When Adam sinned, God thought of all who would descend from Adam as sinners. With respect to inherited corrupted human nature, Grudem says, we have a sinful nature because of Adam's sin. Our nature includes a disposition to sin. We have an inherent tendency to sin that attaches to our lives from the very beginning. Thomas Schreiner, Professor of New Testament Interpretation at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, says this: human beings are born with a corrupt nature. Human beings by nature are deserving of wrath, indicating they are all born with a nature that is sinful. Robert Peterson, who was Professor of Systematic Theology at 2 evangelical seminaries, says this: original sin includes both original guilt and original pollution. Original guilt is the truth that because of Adam's sin, we are all guilty. Original pollution, or as it is also called, original corruption, means that our lives and relationships are stained by sin. George Zemek, Professor of Exegetical Theology at the Expositor Seminary, says this: the spiritual results of the fall, that is the sin of Adam and Eve, the fall, were of the greatest magnitude: separation from God, the guilt of sin. The Bible connects man's actual sin to his sinful nature. The Bible connects man's actual sin and his sinning nature back to the first sin of Adam. R.C.Sproul, the late founder of Ligonier Ministries, who died in December of 2017, says this: since the fall, human nature has been corrupt. We are born with a sin nature. Original sin is the corruption visited on the progeny of our first parents as punishment for the original transgression. Michael Horton, Professor of Systematic Theology at Westminster Seminary in California, says this: Adam and Eve had the freedom to choose immortal life, but in breaking covenant with God, they and their posterity became a race of rebels, born in corruption, guilt and death. It is the concrete act of covenant breaking that marks the descent of humanity into guilt and corruption. John Calvin, of course, the founder of the term Calvinism, and who was a 16th century French theologian and pastor, reformer in Geneva during the Protestant Reformation, says this: We are not corrupted by an acquired wickedness, but bring an innate corruption from the very womb. Before we behold the light of the sun, we are in God's sight defiled and polluted. Being thus perverted and corrupted in all parts of our nature, we are merely on account of such corruption deservedly condemned by God. And John Calvin connects this state of affairs with God's plan, God's will expressed in his decree. This is God's decision to enact certain decisions that he has made. I again ask how it is that the fall of Adam involves so many nations with their infant children in eternal death, without remedy, unless that it so seemed meet to God. The decree, I admit, is dreadful, and yet it is impossible to deny that God foreknew what the end of man was to be before he made him, and foreknew because he had so ordained by his decree. So here we have several quotes from several Calvinists that clearly explicitly state what their understanding of original sin is. Let me summarize this understanding, the Calvinist understanding of original sin, by reading from my book at the conclusion of these quotes that I've given. In examining the claims made by the above authors for original sin, three features appear most prominently: original guilt, corrupted human nature, and universal scope. Adam's sin and the state of being considered guilty before God because of it is attributed to his posterity. We are guilty because of Adam's sin. This judgment arises either directly, as in Augustine and Grudem, or indirectly because we sin due to our corrupt nature, Calvin. What is clearly presented, however, by all Calvinists is the supposed devastating effect of Adam's sin on the human nature of all his descendants, inherited corruption. Original sin means we all suffer a depravity that is fatal as far as relating to God is concerned. Humankind's proclivity is to do only sin. Finally, all Calvinists are agreed the effects of the fall are universal in scope. Everyone, without exception, has been impacted negatively because of Adam's sin, indeed from birth. So summarizing, we can say that the writings of these Calvinists indicate that original sin entails the fact that we are guilty because of Adam's sin, that all inherit a corrupt nature that makes sinning inevitable and causes God to view even babies as sinners, and that it is universal in scope. Calvinists believe that the Bible supports this doctrine, and in the next video we will examine one or two texts that are appealed to by Calvinists to justify this doctrine. I actually examine 6, 2 very briefly, 3 somewhat more detailed, and 1 in a lot of detail.